Welcome to the Depth Dive. Today we're jumping right into the sources about, well, probably the most chaotic and frankly unstable decade in American history. We're talking the 1780s and 90s.
Right. This isn't the triumphant story you might expect right after the revolution. It's actually a period where the whole experiment almost fell apart.
It really looks like it from the sources. Debt, internal fights, a government that just wasn't working.
Exactly. The framework they set up during the war, the Articles of Confederation, it was clear it was failing. What we're seeing in the documents is this almost desperate scramble to build a republic that could actually function. And that meant making some really tough compromises, politically and socially.
Compromises that shaped the nation, but also, it seems, locked in some fundamental disagreements right from the start.
That's the core of it. So our mission today is to unpack how they navigated this. We'll look at the economic mess, the shifts around slavery and women's roles, those flashpoints like Shays Rebellion and the Whiskey Rebellion, and then, the making of the Constitution and the birth of those first political parties under Washington and Adams.
Okay, let's start with the economy right after the war. It sounds dire. What were the biggest immediate problems?
Well, one historian puts it perfectly. America paid a fearful price for victory. Britain immediately treated the U.S. as a hostile competitor.
So no more protected trade within the empire?
None. In fact, they engaged in commercial retaliation. Think about the British West Indies, a huge market for American timber, fish, flour, suddenly, boom, closed off. American goods faced high tariffs everywhere.
Wow, okay. And what about things at home?
Even worse, arguably. You had widespread physical destruction farms, plantations. Cities like New York were heavily damaged. But the financial structure was the real killer.
The government, under the Articles, couldn't tax people directly, could it?
No, it couldn't. It relied on something called requisition, basically asking the states for funds.
Which I imagine didn't work too well.
Not at all. States paid late, or sometimes just didn't pay. So you've got tens of millions in war debt, state and national, no reliable income stream, and the currency they had printed, the continental dollar, was almost worthless. The economy was, well, a wreck.
And other countries noticed this weakness.
Oh, absolutely. There was real contempt. Spain, for instance, refused to recognize American claims west of the Appalachians and, crucially, closed the Mississippi River to American trade.
That must have been devastating for settlers in places like Kentucky and Tennessee.
Completely crippled them. It cut off their main route to market. And the British. They dragged their feet on leaving frontier forts, actively supported Native American resistance against settlers, and even backed separatist groups in Vermont.
Thinking the U.S. would just collapse and come crawling back.
That was the prevailing view in London, yeah. They thought they'll realize they can't make it without us and come hobbling back. Zero respect for the new nation's viability.
It sounds incredibly bleak. But were there any signs of life in the economy, any resilience?
There were, and it's captured nicely in a 1789 portrait by Ralph Earl of a merchant named Elijah Boardman.
Ah, okay. What does that show us?
Well, Boardman was a veteran, now a successful dry goods merchant. He's shown with these, fine textiles, silks, goods imported from Asia. It symbolizes that even amidst the chaos, American merchants were already finding new routes, new markets, now that British restrictions are gone.
Like trading directly with China. I read about that sending ginseng route.
Exactly. Furs and ginseng went out, tea and luxury goods came back. It shows that entrepreneurial spirit kicking in immediately. Small steps, but important ones.
Okay, so a glimmer of economic hope. But the revolution also forced the country to confront some deep social issues, didn't it? Especially around that phrase, all men are created equal. Let's talk about slavery.
Right. The war immediately highlighted a huge geographical split on slavery. In the North, states started down the path of gradual or immediate emancipation. Massachusetts was the first to abolish it completely.
But not in the South.
No. In the South, particularly Virginia and the Carolinas, where the plantation economy depended on enslaved labor, the institution became even more entrenched. Many elites there saw it as a necessary evil, essential for their way of life, and, they argued, the economy.
And Thomas Jefferson, in his notes on the state of Virginia, had a pretty shocking proposal for dealing with this, right?
Shocking is one word for it. It shows how deeply they wrestled with the contradiction, but also the depth of the racism. Jefferson proposed abolishing slavery, yes, but then colonizing all formerly enslaved people.
Colonizing them where? Back to Africa.
To Africa, yeah. Even though most were born in America by this point, he suggested sending them with supplies and then, get this, replacing them by importing an equal number of white inhabitants from Europe.
Wow. A literal population replacement scheme.
That's what it sounds like. His justification was chilling. He believed racial prejudice was so deep-seated that if black people remained free in America, it would only lead to constant conflict, convulsions, and eventually the extermination of the one or the other race. He saw coexistence as impossible.
It really lays bare the fragility and the moral compromises underpinning everything.
Absolutely. And at the same time, you had elite women pushing back against their own legal limitations, specifically the doctrine of coverture.
Remind us what coverture meant legally.
Under coverture, when a woman married, her legal identity was essentially absorbed by her husband's. She became a feme covert, literally, a covered woman. She couldn't own property in her own name, sign contracts, sue or be sued, or control her own wages.
Her husband controlled everything.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Which is why Abigail Adams wrote that famous letter of John in 1776, urging him and the other founders to remember the ladies and not put unlimited power into the hands of husbands.
And didn't John Adams kind of brush her off, calling her saucy?
He did, which is quite revealing. But the push continued. Judith Sargent Murray, in her 1792 essay on the equality of the sexes, made a powerful argument. She said differences in achievement between men and women weren't natural. They were due to unequal access to education. She talked about that mortifying consciousness of inferiority that lack of education created.
So did this lead to any real change?
It led to a new ideal, known as Republican motherhood. It didn't dismantle coverture, but it gave women a specific elevated role within the domestic sphere.
Which was?
To be the primary educators of the next generation. Since men were often away fighting, doing business, women were tasked with instilling Republican virtues in their children, teaching them about civic duty, the heroes of the Revolution like Washington, the importance of liberty.
So a kind of civic education role.
Exactly. Preparing patriotic citizens. It was a form of influence, but still largely confined to the home. And you see this reflected in art, like that Stephen Badlam chest made for a prominent daughter decorated with liberty, or samplers, like Rebecca Monroe's, showing girls learning languages and poetry alongside needlework.
Okay, so social shifts are happening, but slowly. Meanwhile, the political system under the Articles is really starting to crumble. What was the breaking point?
The sources really point to Shays' Rebellion in 1786 as the moment people realized the system was failing catastrophically.
And this wasn't about taxes like the Stamp Act protests, it was about debt, right?
Purely debt. Farmers, many of them veterans like Daniel Shays himself, had fallen deep into debt during the war years due to inflation and land speculation. Now creditors were demanding hard currency they didn't have.
And they faced losing their farms. Or worse.
Or worse. Debtor's prison. Imagine fighting for independence and then facing prison because the currency collapsed and you couldn't pay debts incurred during that fight. So they did what they knew. They rose up. They shut down courthouses to stop foreclosures, sometimes roughing up judges, using the language of the revolution against the new state governments.
And the government response.
Utter failure. Massachusetts couldn't afford to raise a militia to put down the rebellion. The national government under the Articles had zero authority or money to intervene. It took wealthy merchants in Boston pooling their own money to hire a private army.
A private army had to put down a rebellion. Wow.
Shays even threatened to march on Boston, plunder it, and destroy the nest of debt. The rebellion eventually failed. Shays fled, was later pardoned, but the message was clear. For people like George Washington, it was terrifying. It looked like anarchy was just around the corner. This weak government plus economic chaos spelled disaster.
So that fear directly pushed them towards scrapping the Articles.
Directly. It created the urgency for the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787. The consensus was, we need a stronger national government, one that can tax, regulate commerce, and maintain order, with power divided between three branches.
And that convention hammered out some key compromises. The big one structurally was the Great Compromise, right?
Yes. That solved the fight between large states wanting representation based on population and small states wanting equal representation. The solution was a bicameral legislature. The House based on population, the Senate with 2 senators per state, regardless of size.
But then came the really difficult compromises over slavery.
Unavoidable and ugly. You got the 3/5 compromise, where enslaved individuals were counted as 3/5 of a person for calculating state population for the House. This gave southern states more political clout than their free population warranted.
And they kicked the can down the road on the slave trade itself.
They did. They agreed the federal government couldn't ban the international slave trade for at least 20 years until 1808. These were concessions needed to get the southern states on board, but they embedded deep contradictions into the nation's founding document.
Okay, so they have a new constitution, but the massive debt problem still exists. Enter Alexander Hamilton.
As Washington's first Secretary of the Treasury, yes, Hamilton had a bold Federalist vision for fixing the economy and establishing America's place in the world.
What was the core of his plan? It wasn't just about paying off the debt, was it?
That's the crucial part. The total debt, state and federal, was around $78 million, a staggering sum. Hamilton's first move, the federal government would assume all of it, take responsibility for the state debts too.
Okay, consolidating the debt, then what?
Then, he proposed selling $78 million in new federal bonds, essentially refinancing the entire debt. But here's the key.
Yeah.
He didn't plan to pay these bonds off quickly. He wanted a permanent national debt.
Permanent? Why would he want that?
He believed that if the wealthiest, most influential merchants, bankers, and speculators held these government bonds, which paid a steady 4% interest, they would have a direct financial stake in the survival and stability of the new federal government. Their self-interest would ensure their loyalty.
Wow, okay, so the debt itself becomes a tool for political stability.
Exactly. A rather brilliant, if cynical, move. He also needed revenue, so he proposed excise taxes, most famously on whiskey and high protective tariffs, 40–50% on some imported goods, especially from Britain.
Protecting those infant American industries, like the ones Boardman was involved in.
Precisely. Shielding them from cheaper British competition while raising money. And finally, the capstone. A Bank of the United States chartered for 20 years to manage government finances, issue currency, and provide loans.
This sounds like a massive expansion of federal power compared to the Articles. How did he get opponents like Jefferson and Madison to go along?
There was a famous compromise. Jefferson and Madison deeply distrusted the bank and the focus on finance and industry. The deal was, Hamilton gets his financial plan, and in return, the permanent national capital would be located in the South, on the Potomac River, eventually becoming Washington, D.C., away from the northern commercial centers like Philadelphia and New York.
A classic political bargain. And this whole debate really solidified the first political parties, didn't it? The Federalists and the Anti-Federalists.
Well, the Anti-Federalists were those who initially opposed the Constitution's ratification. After ratification, they evolved into the Democratic Republicans, led by Jefferson and Madison. But yes, Hamilton's plan drew the battle lines.
So contrast them for us. Federalists first.
Federalists, like Hamilton and John Adams, favored a strong central government. They believed in a loose construction of the Constitution, meaning if the Constitution didn't explicitly forbid something, the federal government could probably do it, using the necessary and proper or elastic clause. They saw America's future in commerce, manufacturing, and finance, and tended to favor stability, often looking towards Britain as a model.
Okay, and the Democratic Republicans.
Led by Jefferson and Madison, they championed states' rights and feared concentrated federal power. They believed in strict construction. The federal government could only do what the Constitution explicitly said it could. They envisioned America as a nation of independent yeoman farmers, were suspicious of banks and protective tariffs, which they felt benefited the North at the expense of Southern agriculture, and felt a stronger kinship with revolutionary France.
And it was the anti-federalist Democratic Republicans who really pushed for the Bill of Rights, wasn't it?
Absolutely. They demanded it as a condition for supporting the Constitution, to explicitly protect individual liberties like free speech and religion, and to limit the reach of the new federal government. That was a crucial check on Federalist power. You even see the Federalist preference for order and classical models in architecture, like Charles Bulfinch's design for the Massachusetts State House around 1795.
So George Washington becomes the first president under this new, more powerful system. How did he establish its authority?
His presidency was all about setting precedents. Domestically, the big test came in 1793 with the Whiskey Rebellion.
This was about that Hamilton excise tax.
Yes. Farmers in western Pennsylvania, for whom whiskey was a key commodity and medium of exchange, refused to pay the tax. They harassed tax collectors, invoking the same kind of resistance tactics used against the British.
So another Shays-like situation.
Potentially. But Washington's response was completely different. He saw it as a direct challenge to federal authority. He didn't ask nicely. He federalized militias from several states and personally led an army of 13,000 soldiers, an immense force toward Pennsylvania.
The sitting president leading troops in the field.
The only time it's ever happened. He didn't even need to fight seriously. The sheer show of force firing cannons over the rebels' heads was enough. The rebellion collapsed.
What was the precedent set there?
That the federal government was supreme, laws passed by Congress would be enforced. If you disagreed with a law, you had legal means, elections, petitions, but violent resistance would not be tolerated.
Okay, that's domestic policy. What about foreign policy under Washington? Big challenges there too, right?
Huge. The French Revolution led to war between Britain and France. France expected help from the U.S., citing the alliance from the American Revolution and the debt we owed them. Britain, meanwhile, was harassing American shipping.
A tough spot. What did Washington do?
He declared neutrality in 1793. Despite the political pressure and treaty obligations, he argued the young nation was too fragile to get drawn into Europe's wars. This set the precedent for avoiding entangling alliances, a cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy for over a century. Use the Atlantic like a moat.
And we see that authority reflected in art too. You mentioned a portrait.
Yeah, the famous Gilbert Stuart portrait of Washington from 1796. He's depicted formally, but notably, he's got his sword. It's often interpreted as representing the civil authority backed by military power, the power he decisively used during the Whiskey Rebellion.
Okay, so Washington establishes federal authority and neutrality. Then comes John Adams, the second president. His term seems dominated by conflict.
Very much so, both foreign and domestic. The big foreign crisis was the XYZ affair. French agents, publicly referred to only as X, Y, and Z, demanded a hefty bribe just to begin negotiations to stop French seizures of American ships.
A bribe just to talk.
Yeah. Adams refused and publicized the insult. It outraged Americans and swung public opinion sharply against France, leading to an undeclared naval quasi-war.
But then Adams and the Federalists pushed things too far at home.
They did. Riding the wave of anti-French sentiment, the Federalist-controlled Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798. The Alien Acts made it harder for immigrants, often leaning Democratic-Republican, to become citizens. And the Sedition Act made it a crime to criticize the president or Congress.
You couldn't criticize the government. That sounds un-American.
It certainly seemed that way to Jefferson and his party. They saw it as a dangerous step toward monarchy. Adams was already sometimes called his rotundity by opponents. Critically, the Sedition Act didn't forbid criticizing the vice president, who happened to be Thomas Jefferson.
Very convenient. How did the Democratic Republicans respond to this apparent overreach?
With a radical challenge: nullification. The legislatures of Virginia and Kentucky, secretly drafted by Madison and Jefferson respectively, passed resolutions declaring the Alien and Sedition Acts unconstitutional and therefore void or nullified within their states.
Whoa, so states claiming the right to just ignore federal laws they didn't like?
Precisely. It was the first major test of federal supremacy versus states' rights since the Constitution was adopted. A huge constitutional crisis brewing.
And Adams's presidency ended on a controversial note too, right? The midnight appointments.
Yes. After losing the bitter election of 1800 to Jefferson, Adams, in his final hours in office, worked with the outgoing Federalist Congress to create new federal judgeships and fill them, along with other positions, with loyal Federalists. Most famously, he appointed John Marshall as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court.
Trying to lock in Federalist influence even after leaving power.
Absolutely. And it worked. Marshall would dominate the court for decades, establishing key principles of judicial review, like in Marbury v. Madison, and consistently strengthening federal power. It was a lasting legacy.
It's really incredible when you lay it out. In just over a decade, from roughly Shays' Rebellion in 1786 to the end of Adams's term around 1800, the country went from near collapse under the Articles
to having a functioning, powerful federal government under the Constitution, a stable, if controversial, financial system, thanks to Hamilton, and established precedents for both domestic order and foreign policy.
But as you said at the start, that stability came at the cost of deep, ingrained divisions. The compromises needed to create the Constitution immediately fueled the fight between Federalists and Democratic Republicans over what kind of nation it should actually be.
Exactly. The central theme really is that tension. The Constitution was a product of compromises, economic compromises like Hamilton's plan, structural ones like the Great Compromise, moral ones over slavery. But these compromises didn't end the debate. They just defined the battlefield for the ongoing struggle over power.
So the enduring legacy isn't necessarily stability, but maybe that fundamental argument itself.
I think so. That core conflict established in the 1790s between those who trust and favor national power, the Federalist view, and those who distrust national power and favor local or state control, the Jeffersonian view, that argument never really went away. So the provocative thought for you listening is, where do you see that fundamental tension playing out in the country today? That same debate about federal versus state power, national solutions versus local ones, it's arguably the most persistent echo from that chaotic foundational decade.